to the United States, they will be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen. He has been very threatening beyond a normal statement. And as I said, they will be met with fire, fury, and frankly, power, the likes of which this world has never seen before. Thank you.
What a difference a year makes. When Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte met U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson on Monday, he was all smiles. This was in sharp contrast to comments he made last year ahead of a scheduled meeting with then U.S. President Barack Obama, after criticism of his war on drugs.
You know, the Philippines is not a vassal state. We have long ceased to be a colony of the United States.
From that moment on, a cloud of uncertainty hung over ties between the Philippines and the United States, with Duterte threatening to end the two countries' military alliance, among other things. But there had been, in fact, little to no change in U.S.-Philippines relations, especially with Obama now out of the picture.
Considering that there is already, I think, a modus vivendi between President Trump and President Duterte, I don't expect fireworks here.
And there weren't. It was as diplomatic as a high-level meeting could be. Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte declined to mention details of his discussions with U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson. But those present during the first part of the meeting say they heard Duterte tell Tillerson that he is Tillerson's humble friend in Southeast Asia. A friend indeed is how majority of Filipinos view the United States, based on recent surveys. A perception reinforced by the U.S. military's assistance in the ongoing war against ISIL-allied militants in the southern Philippine city of Marawi.
North Korea has promised a thousand-fold revenge against the United States in response to the fresh sanctions against the country Washington has passed through the United Nations. At the latest ASEAN meeting in Manila, Japan reported heated discussions over the North Korean crisis. Among the 10 Southeast Asian member nations, North Korea is not a member. Is our nuclear possession a threat to the world? Or is it just a threat to the United States? We want to make it clear that the worsening situation on the Korean Peninsula, as well as the nuclear issues, were caused by the United States. The regional forum, founded at the height of the Cold War, is celebrating its 50th anniversary at one of the tensest moments in its history.
I underscore the need to strictly and fully implement United Nations Security Council resolutions, including the very recent one, and to further exert pressure on Pyongyang. Many participating countries were on the same page with Japan.
U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson was given a warm welcome from host President Duterte, who's been hostile towards the U.S. in his first year in power. "I am your humble friend," he's reported to have told Tillerson.
The Secretary understands that this is very much like 55 years ago when John F. Kennedy and his administration faced the Cuban Missile Crisis. You may not want him as a leader. We didn't want Castro as a leader. But you have to say to the world, and particularly to their benefactors, which is in this case China instead of Russia, that you must understand this is something we will not tolerate, and diplomatically, or if necessary through force, we are going to stop it. This was the greatest challenge, perhaps, of John F. Kennedy's administration. This is a very similar moment. These are the days that will test Rex Tillerson, Jim Mattis, and the President, because it is exactly like the threat we had more than half a century ago that was faced down diplomatically, but with the explicit potential use of force if that fails. And as Secretary Tillerson goes around, that's the message he has to say, is that we cannot tolerate it. This is not a moment in which we can have long deliberations or some sort of aid program to woo him away from it. This is exactly where we were 55 years ago, and we can't tolerate it.
And we can't flinch. Because as you just heard, our reporter Greg Palcott, who's been inside, behind the curtain, as I put it, of North Korea and seen some of what's going on there in terms of the people on the ground, strength is what they respect, even their citizenry, because they know what their leader is like. So how do we show strength, Congressman, without going to war?
We show it by showing the trading partners, the people who in some cases, and that's what this sanction's about, have been using what amounts to slave labor, North Koreans who work for nothing but food, and the money goes to North Korea to fund their hard money requirements. That is the United Nations Security Council voted unanimously to stop it. And that means that Secretary Tillerson is backed by the entire United Nations, including the explicit permission of China and Russia to cause an end to that funding, which begins to, if you will, put the kind of pressure we've not previously put on North Korea. One thing about North Korea is if they have $4 billion in hard money, they will spend it all on weapons. So we cannot assume that a minor sanction will change their way. Only a true major sanction, one that cuts off aid to his generals and changes his calculus on survival. And that's what we're doing, and we're doing it with the kind of soft power that I don't think we've seen in a long time, power of diplomacy, but absolute, as you said, Harris, unflinching power of diplomacy.
You know, I want to talk about the roles of Russia and China right now. You know, Russia and the investigation and all the focus that's been put into that here recently. They now are very critical players in this whole situation because Nikki Haley, our ambassador at the UN, said thank you to China and Russia for supporting the sanctions against North Korea.
And this is the reality of diplomacy, and I think the American people understand it. On one hand, you may call somebody an evil empire. On another hand, you can call them an unfair trade partner. But when it comes to managing a world at peace, you have to look at the major powers, which include Russia and China even more so today, and you have to be able to work past your differences when it's keeping people out of an atrocious war. You know, 70 years ago in the 1950s, 600,000 or more Chinese died defending North Korea. North Korea could not have survived the Korean War. The conflict was ended at a stalemate because China intervened. And China's well aware that if they don't intervene in favor of North Korea will fall. And that's really why China's vote was so critical. It said to North Korea, enough.
Wow, Congressman, it really is chilling to hear you compare history that wasn't all that long ago with what we're going through today. It puts it in such precision and clarity. I want to talk with you about how politically ready we are, because you hear about authorizations in Congress and can you all get on the same page about anything? Are you on the same page about North Korea?
I believe we are. I know many of my Democratic colleagues on the Armed Services Committee, on the Foreign Affairs Committee, candidly, even on the Intelligence Committee, and we've all looked at much of the same data. We, the House, under Chairman Ed Royce, we added the North Korean sanction language to the bill that the president signed, and he signed it without reservation. So I think what you've seen is broadly House and Senate bipartisan behavior coupled with the president more than acquiescing, but recognizing that all the other challenges are important, but this is one that is time sensitive. We must stop North Korea now, or the South Korean people and be honest, the American people face a threat we cannot tolerate exactly the way, and I said it for a reason. This is the equivalent of John Kennedy's moment for President Trump, and he and his administration so far are rising to the challenge in the way the American people want to see.
Well, and
for Defense of Democracies, he spent more than 13 years at the U.S. State Department. He also advised the six-party talks in 2005, which brought the U.S. and other major nations together to try to tackle North Korea's nuclear program. Once again, the news of the day, Anthony, that we're, for those who are just tuning in, is that North Korea apparently, according to a report in the Washington Post, quoting the Defense Intelligence Agency, North Korea has developed a nuclear weapon small enough to fit on top of an ICBM. That really puts all of the world in danger. What is your view of the U.S. response?
Well, it's certainly a concerning report. I think North Korea has had a nuclear weapons program for over 20 years. So I think assuming that this, or assessing at least that this is the possibility, is a prudent way to go about it for our intelligence agencies. We have the new UN resolution, which was an achievement, but right now, if China has really changed its way and believes North Korea is a liability, the Treasury Department and the State Department could go to China with a specific list of what they need to do and give them a 30-day deadline. And if they don't do it in 30 days, the United States could use its economic power against Chinese banks, Chinese companies, Chinese individuals.
But if the North Koreans have already mated a launchable missile, a launchable warhead to a missile, that kind of puts them in the driver's seat, doesn't it? Don't they have the power to extort whatever they want from the Chinese or maybe the United States?
Well, and I agree. I think that's part of the reason why going back to negotiations at this time would only get us possibly a freeze that the North Koreans would violate at any point that they wanted to.
Because they've done that before. They agreed once before. At
least 4 times.
They agreed once before to get rid of their nuclear program in exchange for aid from the West, and they tore up the deal.
Right. North Korea has a PhD in fleecing the United States and its allies for inducements to give up its weapons programs, knowing that they're not going to do that. That's why strong, robust sanctions campaign like we had with Iran, that could be very short term. It's up to the United States how far to turn this dial. You know, Secretary Tillerson talked about a dial. You can turn it to 11 pretty quick if that's what the Trump administration decides to do.
All right, such as, what more can we do?
Sure. I think the first thing you would do is you can go after Chinese banks. You don't have to designate them. You don't have to freeze their assets, which could harm the U.S. economy, but you could issue fines, and those banks will start to ferret out the North Korea transactions. Go to the Middle East. Talk to some of our partners, as a report last week showed, that are using North Korean laborers, and that's $500 million a year that they're getting there. Go back to China and make clear that we're going to stop every vessel between the two countries. And there are a lot of things. I mean, that's only a very short list. Go to Singapore. Go to the company that's sending luxury goods to North Korea. Unfortunately, the list goes on and on and on because we've spent, unfortunately, the last 10 years really not plugging these loopholes.
But the sanctions on the North Koreans to this point have not accomplished much in the way of what we wanted. Are you saying that sanctions on China and other countries doing business with North Korea would be more effective?
Right. I mean, that's exactly what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, yes, sanctions have failed. They're focused on the wrong areas. We know the right areas. The UN itself has been saying that. The UN has said non-North Koreans are facilitating North Korea sanctions evasion. Who is designated in the new resolution? Only North Koreans and North Korean companies. That's really all you need to know. And the North Korean individuals that were designated are operating in 4 of them are in Russia and 5 of them are in China. So that's really the example of what we're looking at here. And the United States has the example with the Iran sanctions where the United States was not afraid to go after its allies in Europe, in the Middle East, in Asia, and use sanctions against those allies and saying, look, now it's either us or you're working with Iran. In this case, I think people will choose to work with the United States instead of North Korea.
Anthony,
this just completed call with President Moon of South Korea. Very happy and impressed with 15-0 United Nations vote on North Korea sanctions. Here's what U.S. Ambassador Nikki Haley had to say about those sanctions, potential military options, and regime change when she sat down with Maria Bartiromo yesterday on Sunday Morning Futures.
What we basically did was kicked him in the stomach, told him to stop, and said we're not going to put up with it anymore, and the ball is now in North Korea's court. They have a big decision to make. They can either respond by pulling back and saying that they're not going to be a part of this reckless activity anymore, or they can see where it goes, and we'll continue to keep up the strength and keep up the activity to make sure that we stop them.
Are you considering a military option? Troops on the ground? What does that mean?
What it means is the United States are going to always keep our options on the table. You know, we have those military exercises that we have with South Korea. Those have been happening for 40 years. They're very transparent, but they're also meant to defend our allies and to make sure that North Korea knows that we're going to be continuing those exercises. That's not going to stop. What will happen is North Korea has the opportunity to do the right thing, and by stopping this reckless behavior, we will now see. But the United States will respond based on North Korea's actions. We hope that they don't do anything further. We hope that they stop this reckless activity. We hope we don't have to do anything. But all options have always been on the table.
Let me ask you about regime change. Is there an effort underway to launch a coup with the generals in North Korea, to have the generals take over?
The United States is not pushing for regime change. We never have been. What we've said is stop the activity. Our goal is to make North Korea become secure. We want to see a peaceful and secure North Korea. We want to see the region secure. We want to see the Korean Peninsula secure. But we've never pushed for regime change.
First of all, Congressman, I want to get your response to Nikki Haley. All options are on the table.
Well, they always need to be on the table, but the Trump administration deserves a lot of credit. To post up a 15-0 Security Council vote is very important. The key to this obviously resides with China. I was in South Korea meeting with local officials there, talking to our partners in Japan as well. And if North Korea continues to be able to access the Chinese market through the black market, then it really won't make the fundamental difference in change. It's a very difficult border there on the northern part of North Korea. But that's up to the Chinese, but for them to vote in favor of this, I think, was a very positive sign.
So to ask the question about whether or not China will strictly implement the UN resolution, your answer would be?
Well, again, when you look at that long border there on that map, you're going to see that there's a lot of black market trading that is going on. So if you're really trying to cripple them, but we also have to have the military imperative, and that's where we do have a great relationship with South Korea, with Japan. But we also, again, need China to weigh in and make sure that this leader knows that he has no options but to communicate and try to work something out rather than military.
You're giving the president a lot of credit for his efforts here. How is that playing over with his base politically?
I think there's so many different things to be looking at right now that it's hard to say. I think his base is excited by everything that he's doing, and I think the strength that they're showing here is something that's it's also that people are really, really standing behind. I think there's a lot of concern about North Korea. I think there's been so much focus on so many different issues in the administration that people are confused. I think those people who are on the fence and on the left are looking at everything really, really skeptically. They're looking at this and saying, okay, sanctions, they're one thing, and the UN, I mean, I've heard folks who say, you know, you're the same person who's criticized the UN for saying nothing, and now you're bragging about your win in the UN. So it is a really, really dicey time out there, and people are really conflicted, but I think his base is right squarely in his corner.
And meanwhile, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson says North Korea can show it's ready for negotiations by, first of all, stopping missile launches. So what do you make of Tillerson offering these preconditions for talks with the North, Kirsten?
Well, I mean, obviously, this is a great chance, I think, too, for Secretary of State Tillerson to finally come into his limelight here, because he has not necessarily been able to exercise some of the leadership of former Secretary of States because of all of the other, you know, the different dynamics within the White House. I mean, the different centers of power, you know, so this is an opportunity for him to come out very strong. What is interesting, a dynamic here insofar as talks, negotiations are concerned, is the election of President Moon in South Korea just recently, because he was someone who ran a little more dovish on North Korea, saying that talks were more of an option rather than a very hard line and more of a military stance. And that is a shift and a change. So I think Secretary Tillerson is responding to that and putting talks more on the table. But what has worked? You know, what has worked in the 2 decades now, almost 3, that we've been dealing with this? You know, what has worked? Negotiations? I mean, military, you know, the threat of military action, has it worked?
And for North Korea's part, they're calling these sanctions a violent infringement of its sovereignty that was caused by a heinous U.S. plot to isolate and stifle North Korea. It said the UN sanctions will never force the country to negotiate over its nuclear program or to give up its push to strengthen its nuclear capability. So going back to your original point, Congressman.
Well, Rex Tillerson deserves a lot of credit, too. When I was there and met with the foreign minister, when we had a chance to interact with him in South Korea, they had already met 4 times
And yet you never read about that in the mainstream media. So the relationship that we have with South Korea is imperative. Japan is obviously a big part of that. But of course we got to cripple them economically because we don't want them to be the purveyors of terror, and we don't want them to be able to access the materials that they need to develop these nuclear capabilities.
And I think it's part of the process that has to happen. I mean, we've seen that this is a leader who's willing to starve his people by saying we're going to, who cares about sanctions? I'm going to let all these people die. You know, he's a very different kind of person than any of us can imagine negotiating with. But I think it's part of the process that we need to go through, because if we just went straight to something more aggressive, that's really dangerous as well. So
And think of how overcommitted our forces already are. And we still haven't heard from General Mattis and some of the other generals on our strategy moving forward in Afghanistan, where we're, very overstretched, at this point, and we can't keep troops there forever, right? Everyone agrees on that, no matter how much we want to see that country stable and strong in the region, right? So really have to balance our military commitments around the world, and a lot of President Trump's base, as you mentioned, Lee, so rightly, that his base will be in his corner no matter what. But they were very much for the fact that
Scott Lauder. The Pentagon says it's ready to help South Korea put bigger warheads on missiles to deal with the growing threat of North Korea. This is Kim Jong-un threatened thousands-fold revenge and said it will teach a severe lesson to the United States. Okay, so what happened over the weekend? The United Nations Security Council finally slapped the rogue nation with sanctions worth more than $1 billion. That is, by the way, the largest ever against the North Korean regime. But will it matter? We thought we'd give you a little history. The last time the UN imposed sanctions on Iran in 2010, it took 90 days to determine whether the sanctions were necessary. That would bring us to early November for the North Koreans, and that gives that rogue nation even more time to continue testing its missiles, while Kim Jong-un says they already have the capability to hit mainland USA. So, will the sanctions work, or are they too late? We bring in Fox News military analyst and former Air Force Assistant Vice Chief of Staff, retired Lieutenant General Tom McInerney. And you know the region, sir. You served many, many years in the Pacific. Give us your first assessment on whether you believe North Korea, A, can hit the mainland, and B, if he's serious when he says he will make us pay thousandfold.
Well, first of all, I don't believe he can do it right now. Within a year, yes, he's made rapid progress, Liz, and we need to take this serious. Number two, I don't think he really understands what he just said. Now, what I would tell him is, Mr. Kim Jong-un, if one round of artillery goes into Seoul, Korea, you will get our full nuclear retaliatory capability. There will not be a city left in North Korea. You will be finished. Read my lips.
Don't we but okay, hold that thought. Don't we have to back that up? And that would include the deaths of many, many, many civilians. Should we be prepared for that?
I don't know if you fully understood what I said. If he gets our full nuclear retaliatory capability within minutes after one round going into Seoul, there will be nothing left. If you go to airborne alert, we used to call it Chrome Dome, with nuclear weapons, then we start building up our other forces, etc. He will not last 15 minutes, and he can't put enough artillery into Seoul in 10 to 15 minutes, and it's going to be over, because our weapons can hit his artillery pieces. If you think of 2,000 cruise missiles in the air, Liz, and if you think of our full nuclear retaliatory capability, then there's not going to be anything left of North Korea in 15 minutes, completely. And I'd make sure he understood that.
And now I do. I understand exactly what you're saying. You're scaring the crew here, General. But again,
I want to scare them.
I get that. But do you think the Trump administration is ready to put that kind of muscle behind those words?
Well, I believe if they look at the options of trading San Francisco, Seattle, Los Angeles for that, I think they will. We have a president. We have a Secretary of Defense called General Mattis. We have a Secretary of Defense, General Dunford. We have a National Security Advisor, General McMaster. They know what needs to be done. Now, are they going to be as harsh as I am right now? Maybe or maybe not. I had 12 years in the Pacific, 8 tours, and I spent a lot of time there. And that's the only thing Kim Jong-un will understand as will the Russians and the Chinese. That's why I believe they approved that vote.
Yeah.
They are seeing the coercive diplomacy. They know when those three gentlemen made certain statements about full military capabilities, they know what we have. And it must be very clear that we will not accept a nuclear, even though they've detonated 5 weapons, North Korea with ICBMs. That is not acceptable.
Do you feel that they could reach New York or Los Angeles, as they claim they're about to be able to do, or even Chicago?
Not now, within a year. But then it's too late if we start to do something a year from now.
Which brings me to November. I mean, if it takes 3 months, and who knows with the UN, the wheels of the UN work remarkably slowly and unfairly. So who knows with them, will that put us at a disadvantage? Because the closer and closer he gets, maybe he holds some power here, even if we had that THAAD missile system on the ground in South Korea to intercept those missiles.
He does. By the way, you were very kind to the UN to put it that way. The fact is, it's a lot worse than that. But that's why I would start politically. I would form a political area treaty organization similar to NATO. I would have South Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Philippines, Thailand, and other countries out there form a bulwark not only against North Korea expansion, but at Chinese expansion. I would start moving in more THAAD missiles. I would put our nuclear retaliatory capability on ground alert that we used to have there when I was at DCS Operations and Intelligence for the Pacific. I'd put that back in, of course, with the approval of South Korea. I would start increasing our naval and air forces in the region. And so I would start doing those things now to lead turn the problem that you said. It's not going to be till November till we see the real impact, to start lead turning this. We do not have a year left. This president was left the worst geopolitical situation for the United States since before World War II.